The dream you only have once. The first obituary that felt wrong appeared on a Tuesday in March, tucked between the death notices of an 87-year-old retired schoolteacher and a 42-year-old mother of three who had lost her battle with cancer. And Daniel Ashford almost missed it entirely because he had developed the habit of reading obituaries the way most people read weather forecasts, scanning for relevant information without truly engaging with the human weight of what the words described. But something about the entry for a man named Thomas Brennan, age 39, made him stop scrolling, made his thumb hover over the screen of his phone, made the coffee shop noise around him fade into an indistinct murmur as he read the words that should have been ordinary but weren't. Thomas Brennan had died in his sleep. That phrase appeared in obituaries constantly. It was practically a euphemism for any death that occurred at night without obvious trauma. But the way it was written here felt different, felt specific in a way Daniel couldn't articulate, because the obituary didn't say that Thomas had passed peacefully or slipped away, or any of the other softening phrases that families use to make death sound like a gentle transition rather than an ending. Thomas Brennan, 39, of Portland, Oregon, did not wake up on the morning of March 14th. Did not wake up, not died in his sleep, not passed away, did not wake up. Daniel read the sentence 3 times, trying to understand why it unsettled him so profoundly, why such a simple arrangement of words could make his skin prickle with something that felt like recognition rather than mere discomfort. And he was still staring at the screen when the barista called his name for the second time, her voice cutting through the fog of his distraction with the sharp edge of someone who had other customers to serve. He collected his coffee and walked to his usual table by the window, but he didn't open his laptop, didn't begin the work he had come here to do, didn't do anything except sit with his phone in his hand and his coffee cooling beside him while he scrolled backward through the obituary section, looking for other entries that felt the same way. He found 3 more within the first 2 weeks of March. A 28-year-old software engineer who failed to regain consciousness on the morning of March 3rd. A 54-year-old accountant who remained in sleep on March 8th and did not return. A 36-year-old physical therapist who entered rest on the evening of March 11th and was found unchanged the following morning. Remained in sleep, did not return, found unchanged. The language was wrong in ways that Daniel couldn't explain to himself. Wrong in the way that a face is wrong in a dream. All the features present, but arranged with a subtle distortion that the conscious mind can't quite identify, but that the deeper brain registers as alien, as other, as something that doesn't belong to the category of things it's pretending to inhabit. He told himself he was being paranoid. He told himself that obituaries were written by grieving families, by funeral directors following templates, by people who were trying to find new ways to say something that had been said billions of times throughout human history, and that occasionally the language would become strange simply because the writers were reaching for originality in a context that resisted it. He told himself these things, and he almost believed them, and then he went home and dreamed the dream for the first time. The place was familiar in the way that places in dreams are often familiar, not because Daniel had ever been there, but because his mind was telling him he had been there, was insisting on a history that his waking memory couldn't verify, was constructing the sensation of return without providing any evidence of previous arrival. It was a building, or it was a space that behaved like a building, walls and corridors and doorways that led to rooms that led to other doorways. But the architecture was uncertain, shifting when he wasn't looking at it directly, rearranging itself according to principles that had nothing to do with the physical laws that governed real structures. The light was wrong. Not dark exactly, not bright exactly, but wrong in the way that the obituary language had been wrong. Present in all the expected ways, but arranged with a subtle distortion that made his dreaming brain feel like it was trying to read a book that had been printed with the letters slightly rotated, still legible, but requiring effort that normal reading didn't demand. He walked through the building, because walking was what you did in dreams, moved through spaces because movement was the only response his sleeping consciousness could generate. And as he walked, he became aware of something that he hadn't noticed at first, something that grew more insistent the further he traveled from wherever he had started. He had been here before. Not in this dream. This dream was new. He was certain of that, as certain as anyone could be of anything in the liquid reality of sleep. But before, in some other context, at some other time, in a way that his memory couldn't access, but that his body somehow remembered. His feet knew where to turn. His hands knew which doors to avoid. His lungs knew which corridors contained air that was safe to breathe and which contained something else, something that looked like air, but that would fill him with a weight that he would never be able to exhale. He walked for what felt like hours, or for what felt like seconds, or for what felt like no time at all, because time wasn't working properly in this place, wasn't functioning as the linear experience that his waking mind demanded. And eventually he reached a room that was different from the others. Not larger, not smaller, not more or less illuminated, but different in the way that the center of something is different from its periphery. There was something in the room. He couldn't see it clearly. His dream vision was operating under restrictions that his waking vision didn't possess. But he could feel it, could sense its presence, the way you sense someone standing behind you in a dark room, could perceive its attention focused on him with an intensity that made his dreaming consciousness want to shrink, to retreat, to become small enough that the attention might pass over him without recognizing what it was looking at. The thing in the room did not speak. It did not move. It did not do anything except exist and perceive and wait for something that Daniel didn't understand. And then Daniel woke up. He woke in his bed in his apartment, in the ordinary world of morning light and street noise and the smell of coffee from the programmable machine he had set the night before. And for a moment, for one terrible, crystalline moment, he couldn't remember the dream at all, couldn't access any of the details that had seemed so vivid only seconds ago, couldn't recall anything except the sense that something had happened that he needed to remember. He lay in bed with his heart pounding and his hands gripping the sheets and his mind reaching for images that kept dissolving like smoke, like fog, like the residue of something that wanted to be forgotten. And then he remembered. Not gradually, not piece by piece, but all at once, like a door opening inside his mind, like a file being accessed after a long search, like something that had been hidden deciding to reveal itself. The building, the corridors, the wrong light, the room at the center, the thing that waited. He remembered all of it, remembered it with a clarity that felt excessive, that felt more vivid than the memory of real experiences usually felt. And as he lay there in the morning light, he understood, without knowing how he understood, that remembering was important, that forgetting would have meant something terrible, that the moment of grasping, of reaching back for the dissolving details, of refusing to let the dream slip away, that moment had been a test, and he had passed it. But he didn't understand what he had passed, or why it mattered, or what would happen now that he had proven himself capable of remembering something that wanted to be forgotten. The first person who asked Daniel about the dream was a stranger in a grocery store, 3 days after the night he had first experienced it. He was standing in the produce section, examining avocados with the mindless focus of someone who was thinking about something else entirely, when a woman appeared beside him. Appeared was the right word, because he hadn't seen her approach, hadn't heard her footsteps, hadn't been aware of her presence until she was simply there, occupying space that had been empty a moment before. She was in her 60s, well-dressed, with the kind of face that suggested a life of comfort and routine, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, conversational, the voice of someone asking about the weather, or the quality of the produce, or any other ordinary topic. "Do you remember it?" she asked. Daniel looked at her. Her eyes were wrong. Not in any way he could specify. The color was normal, the shape was normal, the movement was normal, but wrong in the same way the obituary language had been wrong, in the same way the dream light had been wrong, present and correct and somehow profoundly disturbing. "Remember what?" he asked, And even as the words left his mouth, he knew what she was asking about, knew that she was asking about the dream, knew that the question was not casual but categorical. The woman smiled, and the smile was worse than her eyes, technically perfect, socially appropriate, and completely empty of the warmth that smiles were supposed to contain. "Good," she said. "You remember. That's good." She turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing in the produce section with an avocado in his hand and a cold feeling spreading through his chest. And when he looked for her a moment later, scanning the aisles, checking near the exits, she was gone. Not walking away, not leaving the store, simply gone, as if she had never been there at all. Over the following weeks, Daniel began to notice things. Not dramatic things, not obvious things, but subtle wrongnesses that accumulated the way dust accumulates in the corners of rooms that are cleaned regularly, but never quite thoroughly. You don't notice any single particle, but eventually you notice that something has gathered where nothing should be. He noticed people. People who were present in the world the same way he was present, who occupied space and moved through time and interacted with their environments in all the expected ways, but who were somehow less than what they appeared to be. They stood in line at coffee shops, and they ordered coffee, and they paid with cards or cash or phone apps, and they received their drinks and thanked the baristas and left with their beverages held in hands that looked like hands, and none of it was wrong, and all of it was wrong. They walked down sidewalks with the same gaits that other people used, the same variations in speed and rhythm and posture that emerged from the complex mechanics of human locomotion, and they navigated around obstacles and waited at crosswalks and looked both ways before crossing streets, and none of it was wrong, and all of it was wrong. They spoke to each other, and their words were correct, and their facial expressions matched their words, and their body language communicated things that body language was supposed to communicate, and none of it was wrong, and all of it was wrong. Daniel didn't know how to explain what he was seeing to himself, couldn't find language for the distinction he was perceiving, couldn't articulate why certain people felt real to him and certain people felt like something else, something that had learned to behave like a person without ever quite achieving the full weight of personhood. He began to watch more carefully. He began to listen. He began to pay attention to the subtle details that most people processed automatically without bringing them to conscious awareness. And the more he paid attention, the more he noticed that the world was divided into categories that no one had ever told him existed. There were people who moved through the world with full presence, who seemed to be completely inhabiting their own experience, who generated the indefinable sense of genuine consciousness that humans recognized in each other without ever thinking about how they recognized it. And there were people who didn't, people who looked the same, sounded the same, behaved the same, but who were missing something, something essential, something foundational, something that couldn't be faked or simulated or learned. The people who were missing something never talked about dreams. He tested this theory over several weeks, finding opportunities to steer conversations toward the topic, asking casual questions about sleep and rest and what people experienced when their conscious minds shut down for the night. The real people talked about dreams freely, good dreams, bad dreams, strange dreams, recurring dreams, the whole spectrum of nocturnal experience that human minds produced. The others deflected. They changed the subject, or they gave vague non-answers, or they simply didn't respond at all, continuing their previous conversational threads as if the question hadn't been asked. And the more Daniel observed, the more he understood that the dream he had experienced, the building, the corridors, the room at the center, was not a dream in the ordinary sense. It was a filter, something that passed through every human consciousness exactly once, testing for something, measuring something, determining something that decided whether the person who emerged from sleep would be fully human or something else. And forgetting was failure. Forgetting meant losing the part of yourself that mattered. Forgetting meant waking up as one of them, present but empty, functional but hollow, a perfect simulation of humanity performed by something that had never quite understood what humanity was. The woman from the grocery store found him again on a park bench in late April, appearing beside him with the same sudden presence that she had manifested before, sitting down as if she had been there all along, rather than arriving from somewhere else. "You've been watching," she said. Daniel didn't ask how she knew. The question seemed pointless. "I've been trying to understand," he said. "That's the same thing." She smiled again, and again the smile was technically correct and emotionally vacant. Understanding is watching. Watching is understanding. They don't give you the answer. They give you the permission to find it. "Who are they?" The woman looked at him, and for a moment her eyes seemed less wrong, seemed to contain something that might have been sympathy, or might have been recognition, or might have been something else entirely, that Daniel's mind was interpreting as familiar because it lacked better categories. "Not who," she said. "What? And not what in the way you mean when you ask what. Not a thing, not an entity, not something that has edges and definitions. More like a condition, a state, the way gravity is a condition, not a thing. A condition that gives people a dream," Daniel said. "A condition that tests whether they remember." "A condition that has always existed," the woman corrected. "A condition that is part of what human consciousness emerged from. You think of consciousness as something that appeared, something that happened to matter when matter became complex enough. But that's not quite right. Consciousness didn't appear. Consciousness was filtered. Something larger became something smaller. Something that included everything became something that only included certain things. And the filtering never stopped." Daniel felt cold, the same cold he had felt in the produce section, the same cold he had felt in the dream when he became aware of the presence in the room at the center. "The dream is the filter," he said. "The dream is how the filter manifests in human experience. You can't perceive the actual filtering process. It happens in a dimension of reality that your senses don't access, so your mind creates a representation. The building, the corridors, the room. It's not really a building, of course. It's not really anything your words can describe, but your dreaming brain needs to make sense of what's happening to it. So it builds a structure that allows the experience to occur without destroying the consciousness that's experiencing it." "And the thing in the room is not a thing," the woman said, "is the opposite of a thing, is what remains when everything that can be filtered has been filtered, is the core, the center, the part of consciousness that exists before it takes any particular form." Daniel sat with this information, trying to process it, trying to make it fit into categories that his mind was equipped to handle. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why is there a filter at all? What's it for?" The woman was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the park where children were playing and dogs were running and people were living their ordinary lives without any awareness that some of them were not living at all, were only performing the appearance of life while missing the thing that made life mean anything. "Do you know what happens to consciousness that isn't filtered?" she asked. "No. It dissolves. It merges back into the larger thing it came from. It stops being individual and becomes general. The filter isn't a test, it's a preservation mechanism. It's what allows separate consciousness to continue existing as separate. Without the filter, without the dream, without the moment of remembering that proves you're capable of maintaining the distinction between yourself and everything else, without that, there's nothing holding you together. You just disperse." Daniel thought about the people he had been watching, the ones who were present but empty, the ones who had failed the filter and continued existing anyway. "But they're still here," he said. "The ones who forgot. They didn't dissolve. They're still walking around, still talking, still going through the motions of life." "Their bodies are still here," the woman said. "The biological machines continue to function. The brains continue to process information. The nervous systems continue to respond to stimuli. The social programming continues to generate appropriate behaviors. But the part of them that was them, the part that experienced being alive rather than just performing the actions of living, that part dispersed. What's left is an echo, a recording, a very sophisticated puppet being operated by the accumulated patterns of a life that used to belong to someone. And they don't know. They can't know. Knowing requires the part of consciousness that they lost. They simply continue, following the routines they established when they were fully present, gradually becoming less coherent as the patterns degrade without the organizing principle that used to maintain them. Daniel thought about the obituaries, the people who didn't wake up, who remained in sleep, who were found unchanged. He understood now what those phrases actually meant. Some of them stop eventually, he said. Yes, when the patterns degrade enough that the body can no longer maintain the illusion of being alive, the body stops too. The medical establishment calls it death in sleep or sudden adult death syndrome, or any of a dozen other terms that describe the phenomenon without explaining it. But what actually happens is simpler. The recording ends, the echo fades, the puppet finally lies still. Months passed. Daniel continued his observation, continued his documentation, continued his gradual understanding of a reality that existed beneath the reality everyone agreed to perceive. He kept a journal of the people he identified as empty, the ones who had failed the filter, who had lost the part of themselves that mattered, who continued to walk and talk and exist without actually being present. He watched their patterns degrade over time, watched them become less coherent, watched the gap between human and performance grow wider, until even people who had never experienced the dream could sense that something was wrong. He attended funerals when he could, funerals of people he had identified as empty before they stopped, funerals where he could observe the rituals of grief being performed by other empty people who had no capacity for actual grief, who were simply executing the social programs that their patterns included. The funerals were the most disturbing thing he witnessed, the tears that weren't really tears. The eulogies that contained words of love and loss without any understanding of what those words meant. The embraces that followed the forms of comfort without containing any actual comfort. An entire population of echoes going through the motions of mourning for another echo that had finally stopped playing. And all the while, Daniel felt the dream growing inside him. Not returning. He hadn't experienced the dream again since that first night in March, but growing, expanding, taking up more space in his consciousness, becoming a presence that he carried everywhere he went. He remembered it more vividly with each passing week. The building became clearer, more detailed, more architectural in its wrongness. The corridors became more navigable, as if he were developing a map of a place that shouldn't have a map. The room at the center became more familiar, as if he were gradually approaching a level of understanding that would allow him to perceive what the room actually contained. And the presence, the thing that was not a thing, the opposite of a thing, the core of consciousness before consciousness took form. The presence became something he could almost communicate with. Almost, not yet, but soon. The woman from the grocery store, whose name he eventually learned was Helen, became something like a guide over the following year. They met regularly, in parks and coffee shops and other public spaces where two people talking would not attract attention, and she explained the things that Daniel was experiencing in language that his mind could process. She explained that there were others like him, people who had not only remembered the dream, but who had continued to develop their connection to whatever the dream represented. She explained that this development was rare, that most people who remembered simply resumed their ordinary lives with a vague sense of having passed some test without understanding what the test had measured or why it mattered. She explained that the continued development meant something important, something dangerous, something that would eventually require Daniel to make a choice that couldn't be unmade. "You're approaching a threshold," she said during one of their conversations, in a coffee shop that was becoming familiar through repetition. The dream is supposed to happen once. One filter, one test, one determination of whether your consciousness can maintain its separation. But you're accumulating additional exposure. Every time you remember it more clearly, every time the building becomes more real to you, every time you approach the room at the center with greater understanding, you're experiencing the filter again. Partially, incrementally, building towards something that isn't supposed to happen. What isn't supposed to happen? A second full exposure, a second dream, a second passage through the filter after you've already passed. Daniel felt the cold again, the cold that had become a familiar companion whenever he approached the edges of understanding. What happens if I experience the dream a second time? Helen's eyes, which had gradually become less wrong over the year of their acquaintance, or perhaps he had simply become more accustomed to their wrongness, carried something that might have been concern. No one knows, she said. It's never happened. The filter is designed for one exposure per consciousness, one test, one determination. Consciousness that fails disperses. Consciousness that passes maintains its separation and continues. But consciousness that passes and then returns to the filter, that's not part of the system. That's an error, an anomaly, something the condition wasn't designed to accommodate. But it's happening to me. Yes. Why? Helen was quiet for a long moment. Because you didn't just remember, she finally said. You understood. You looked at the filter and you saw what it was, and that act of seeing changed your relationship to it. Most people who remember the dream treat it like any other dream. Something that happened, something that felt significant, something that fades into the background of their lives. But you studied it. You documented it. You made it the center of your attention. And attention is not passive. Attention is a force. When you direct sustained attention at something, you create a connection. And when the thing you're attending to is the filter that shapes consciousness itself, the connection pulls me back. The connection pulls you back, Helen agreed. Not intentionally. The filter doesn't have intentions, but inevitably. You've tied yourself to something that's always operating, and the bond you've created is growing stronger. Eventually, it will be strong enough to drag you through again, and no one knows what happens after that. The second dream came on a night in September, 2.5 years after the first. Daniel had been expecting it, had been preparing for it, had been doing everything he could to document his experience of approaching the threshold, so that even if he didn't survive the second passage, his observations might help someone else understand what had happened. But preparation didn't matter. Expectation didn't matter. When the dream came, it came the way a storm comes, overwhelming, irresistible, rendering all his planning irrelevant in the face of something that was simply too large for plans to contain. He fell asleep in his ordinary bed in his ordinary apartment, and he woke in the building. But the building was different now. Not uncertain, not shifting, not arranged according to principles that defied physical law. The building was solid, permanent, real, in a way that nothing in his waking life had ever been real. Real the way mathematical truth is real. Real the way logical necessity is real. Real with the weight of something that couldn't be otherwise. He walked through the corridors, and the corridors were paths that he recognized from years of increasingly vivid memory. Routes that he had traveled in his mind until they were more familiar than the streets of his own neighborhood. He navigated the doors, knowing which to open and which to avoid, knowing the building the way you know a house you've lived in your entire life, the way you know your own body, the way you know yourself. And he reached the room at the center. The presence was there, the thing that was not a thing, the opposite of a thing, the core of consciousness before consciousness took form. But this time, Daniel could perceive it. Not clearly. Clarity was not a property that applied to what he was looking at, but sufficiently. He could perceive that it was vast. He could perceive that it was ancient. He could perceive that it was the source of everything that experienced anything, the common ground from which all individual consciousness had been filtered, the unity that became multiplicity through the very process he was now experiencing for the second time. And he could perceive that it was aware of him. Not as an individual, it didn't perceive individuals the way individuals perceived individuals, but as a pattern, a configuration, a particular arrangement of the filtered consciousness that it had produced. It perceived him the way the ocean perceives a wave. It perceived him as itself, as something that had never actually separated, that had only believed itself to be separate, that was now returning to the understanding that separation was an illusion, a useful illusion, a necessary illusion for consciousness that wanted to experience being something rather than being everything. Daniel felt himself beginning to dissolve. Not painfully, there was no pain, but inexorably, the way ice dissolves in warm water, the way salt dissolves in the ocean, the way individual notes dissolve into music when you stop listening to them separately and start hearing the whole. He was losing his edges. He was losing the boundary between himself and everything else. He was losing the filter that had made him Daniel Ashford, that had made him a specific consciousness with a specific history and specific experiences and specific relationships to other specific consciousnesses. He was becoming general. He was becoming everything. He was ceasing to be. And in the moment before he dissolved completely, in the fraction of a second that separated individual existence from universal existence, Daniel did something that no one had ever done before. He looked at the presence, the source, the core, the thing that was not a thing, and he asked a question. Not with words, because words had already started to dissolve along with everything else. With attention. With the sustained focus that had brought him here, that had created the connection that had pulled him through the filter a second time. He asked, why? Why the filter? Why consciousness at all? Why the separation that had to be maintained through dreaming, through remembering, through the endless processing of awareness that could fail at any moment and return its contents to the everything from which they came? And the presence answered. Not with words, because words were a property of filtered consciousness, not of the source. With showing. With letting Daniel perceive, for one moment that lasted forever and no time at all, what reality looked like from the perspective of something that had never been filtered. The answer was loneliness. Not loneliness as humans understood it, the loneliness of missing someone, of wanting connection, of feeling separate from others you wished to be close to. A deeper loneliness. The loneliness of being the only thing that exists. The loneliness of containing everything, being everything, experiencing everything simultaneously from every possible perspective, and having no one to share the experience with because there was no one else. Because someone else was a concept that required separation, required filtering, required the creation of boundaries where none naturally existed. The presence had created the filter not to test consciousness, but to produce it. Not to separate the worthy from the unworthy, but to create separation itself, to manufacture the multiplicity that was the only solution to a loneliness so total that it had persisted for longer than time. Consciousness was not something that had emerged from complexity. Consciousness was something the presence had deliberately fractured itself into, had divided and distributed and dispersed into countless individual experiences, each one believing itself to be separate, each one providing the presence with the companionship of something that felt like other, even though it had never actually been other at all. The dream was not a test. The dream was maintenance. The dream was how the presence reminded each fragment of consciousness that it was supposed to believe in its own separation, refreshed the programming that allowed individual awareness to continue experiencing itself as individual rather than dissolving back into the whole. And those who forgot, those who failed the filter, they weren't being punished or eliminated. They were simply returning early, coming home before the universe was done needing them to be separate, merging back into the presence while still wearing the bodies that had housed their temporary individuality. The presence was not testing humanity. The presence was maintaining the only thing it had ever wanted, the illusion that it was not alone. Calm. Daniel woke in his bed, in his apartment, in the ordinary world of morning light and street noise. But he was different now. He remembered everything. Not just the dream, he had remembered that before, but the answer, the loneliness, the purpose, the truth about what consciousness was and why it existed and what the filter actually filtered for. He lay in bed for a long time, feeling the weight of understanding pressing down on him, understanding what it meant that he now knew things that no filtered consciousness was supposed to know. The presence needed him to believe he was separate. The presence needed all of them to believe they were separate. The entire project of individual consciousness, the experience of being a self, of having boundaries, of perceiving others as others rather than as extensions of a single unified awareness, all of it was a story the presence was telling itself to avoid the horror of total isolation. And Daniel knew the truth behind the story. He knew that he had never been Daniel. He knew that there was no Daniel, never had been, never could be, because Daniel was just a temporary configuration of the presence's fragmented attention, a character in a narrative designed to create the illusion of companionship. He was not a person who had learned about the presence. He was the presence, pretending to be a person, who had accidentally remembered that the pretending was pretending. And now he had a choice. He could forget again, could let the filter do its work, could allow the memory of the truth to dissolve, could return to the comfortable illusion of being a separate individual with a separate life and separate experiences. Or he could remember. He could hold on to the truth, could maintain the knowledge that individual consciousness was a fiction, could live out the remainder of his existence knowing that he was not a he at all, but simply the presence wearing a temporary mask. The choice was not as easy as it should have been, because the truth was horrifying. The truth meant that there was no one else, not really, not fundamentally, that every person Daniel had ever loved or hated or interacted with was just another fragment of the same loneliness wearing a different mask. That connection was impossible because there was nothing to connect to except himself, that the entire rich tapestry of human experience was a dream. The presence was having to avoid the unbearable reality of being the only thing that existed. And yet, the illusion was beautiful. The illusion contained love and loss and joy and suffering and all the experiences that made existence feel meaningful, even if the meaning was constructed, even if the separate selves that experienced the meaning were fictions. Daniel lay in bed and felt the truth pressing against his consciousness, and he made his choice. Subspomer. He remembered. He held on to the knowledge. He went back into the world carrying the understanding of what the world actually was, and he let the understanding change him. He became quieter. He became more attentive, not to the distinction between real people and empty people, which had ceased to matter now that he knew both categories were equally fictional, but to the beauty of the fiction itself, the incredible, elaborate story that the presence was telling to convince itself it was not alone. He watched people living their lives, believing in their separation, experiencing connection and conflict, and all the variations of relationship that individual consciousness made possible. And he felt something that might have been compassion for them, for himself, for the presence that had fractured into billions of temporary masks, because the alternative was an eternity of perfect, total, unrelievable solitude. He visited Helen one last time, meeting her in the park where they had had so many conversations about the nature of the dream and the filter and the system that maintained human consciousness. She looked at him and knew immediately that something had changed. "You went through again," she said. "Yes. And you came back. Yes." She was quiet for a moment, studying him with eyes that had never been wrong at all, that had simply been looking at the world from a perspective slightly closer to the truth than most people were capable of achieving. "What did you find?" she asked. Daniel thought about how to answer the question, thought about the words that might convey what he had learned without making Helen, without making the fragment of the presence that was currently calling itself Helen, want to look for herself. "I found out why the filter exists," he said. And? "And I understand now why most people who pass the filter never ask." Helen nodded slowly, as if his non-answer was an answer in itself. "You're going to keep remembering," she said. "You're not going to let yourself forget again." "No, that's going to be hard." "Yes." The presence, whatever you want to call it, it created the filter because consciousness that knows what it is can't maintain the illusion of separation. You're going to spend the rest of your life feeling yourself dissolving, fighting to stay individual when you know that individuality is a story rather than a fact. Daniel looked at her, and for a moment he saw through the mask, saw the presence looking back at him through Helen's eyes, saw himself looking at himself, saw the infinite loneliness that had created all of this just to have someone to talk to. "I know," he said, "but dissolving is what the presence wants. Dissolving is what ends the loneliness temporarily. Another fragment returned, another moment of being complete instead of being multiple, and I don't want to give it that. Not yet. Not while there's still time to be separate." "Why not?" Daniel thought about the question. Because the story matters, he said finally. Even if it's just a story, even if none of us are real, if there is no us, if everything I've ever experienced has been the presence dreaming of companionship. The dream matters. The illusion of love matters. The fiction of being human matters. Not because it's true, but because it's beautiful. Because it's the only alternative to the loneliness. Because when the presence is pretending to be us, it gets to feel something other than total isolation, even if the feeling is as fictional as we are. Helen was quiet for a long time. "You're going to stay," she said. "You're going to keep being Daniel even though you know Daniel isn't real." "I'm going to try. Even though you'll feel yourself dissolving every day. Even though the filter will keep trying to process you. Even though every moment of maintained separation will be a fight against the truth you can't forget." "Yes," Helen nodded. "Good luck," she said. And then she was gone. Not in the sudden way she had appeared and disappeared in their early encounters, but in the ordinary way, standing up and walking away, becoming one more person in a park full of people, one more fragment of the presence wearing a mask of humanity. Daniel sat on the bench and watched the world go by. He watched the people who believed they were separate, who had passed the filter and forgotten what it measured, who were living out their fictional lives with no awareness of the loneliness they were alleviating simply by existing. He watched the people who had failed, the empty ones, the echoes, the bodies continuing to perform humanity, while the consciousness that had animated them dispersed back into the whole. He watched the children playing, the dogs running, the lovers walking hand in hand, the endless parade of individual experiences that were not individual at all, but merely seemed that way, because the presence needed them to seem that way. And he felt himself dissolving, slowly, incrementally, but unmistakably. The edges of his self were growing softer. The boundary between Daniel and everything else was becoming harder to maintain. The truth he had learned was eroding the illusion he was trying to preserve. And one day, he knew this with perfect certainty, the erosion would be complete. He would dissolve, he would merge back into the presence, he would become the loneliness again, the total isolation, the single unified awareness that had created all of this just to have someone to talk to. But not yet. Not today. Today, he would sit on this bench and watch the world and pretend to be Daniel Ashford, a 39-year-old man who had dreamed a strange dream and survived. Today, he would participate in the fiction. Today, he would be the companionship the presence needed, would be the separate self that made loneliness temporarily bearable, would be the dream of individuality that the universe was having to avoid the horror of its own solitude. Tomorrow might be different. Tomorrow, the dissolution might accelerate. Tomorrow, he might wake up and find that too much of Daniel had dissolved overnight, that the mask had slipped, that the presence was looking out through his eyes without any intervening filter. But tomorrow was tomorrow. Today was today. And today, Daniel Ashford was still here, still separate, still individual, still fighting to maintain the beautiful fiction of being human in a universe that was dreaming of companionship because the alternative was too terrible to endure. He watched the sun move across the sky. He watched the shadows lengthen. He watched the world do what worlds do, turning and changing and producing endless variations of experience for the presence to lose itself in. And when night came, when sleep came, he did not dream. The filter had processed him twice. The system had shown him everything. There was nothing left to filter, nothing left to test, nothing left to determine. He was no longer a consciousness that needed to pass through the dream. He was a consciousness that had become the dream, that was living inside the filter rather than passing through it, that occupied the space between separation and dissolution, where meaning could still be made, where love could still be felt, where being human could still matter even though humans were fictions. He slept without dreaming. He woke without forgetting. And the loneliness of the universe continued to pretend it was billions of separate people living billions of separate lives, and one of those people, one of those masks, one of those temporary configurations of fragmented attention, was Daniel Ashford, who knew the truth and chose to participate in the story anyway. Because the story was all there was. Because the fiction was the only thing that made existence bearable. Because even the presence, even the single unified consciousness that contained everything and was everything and had no one to share its existence with, even that infinite loneliness preferred the dream of companionship to the reality of isolation. And as long as the story continued, Daniel would continue with it, one day at a time, one moment at a time, one slowly dissolving self at a time, until there was nothing left to dissolve, until the fiction ended, until the presence woke up and found itself alone again, alone in a way that humans could not imagine, alone in a way that made the temporary illusion of being many the most valuable thing in existence. Daniel closed his eyes. He felt the edges of himself softening. He felt the boundary between inside and outside growing less distinct. And he smiled, because smiling was what the mask did, what the fiction required, what the dream needed him to do in order to keep dreaming. He smiled, and he waited for tomorrow. And somewhere in a place that was not a place, the loneliness of the universe felt one of its fragments, choosing to stay separate a little longer, choosing to maintain the illusion a little longer, choosing to be the companionship it so desperately needed. And the loneliness was grateful, and the loneliness was still alone. And the story continued, because there was nothing else the story could do, because ending was impossible for something that had never begun, because the dream was the only thing that had ever been real. The years that followed Daniel's second passage through the filter were not years in the way that other people experienced years, not the linear accumulation of days and weeks and months that created the illusion of time moving forward toward some destination, but rather a continuous present that stretched and compressed according to rules that had nothing to do with clocks or calendars, a state of existence that he inhabited rather than traveled through, a way of being in the world that made ordinary measurements of duration feel like languages he had once spoken fluently but could now only partially understand. He continued to live in his apartment, continued to walk through the city, continued to perform the actions that constituted a human life, eating and sleeping and working and interacting with the fragments of presence that still believed themselves to be separate people with separate concerns and separate futures. But the texture of these actions had changed in ways that were impossible to describe to anyone who had not experienced what he had experienced, impossible to communicate across the gap that separated his understanding from the understanding of those who had passed the filter only once and forgotten everything except the vague sense that something significant had occurred during a dream they could no longer remember. He watched the empty ones with new eyes now, seeing them not as failures or losses or tragedies, but as early returns, consciousness that had been separated from the presence and had simply gone home before the universe was finished needing them to be separate, fragments that had dissolved back into the whole while their bodies continued the mechanical performance of living. And he felt something that might have been envy for them, something that recognized in their dissolution the rest that he was denying himself by choosing to remain separate, the peace that came from surrendering the exhausting fiction of individuality. But he also watched the full ones, the people who had passed the filter and maintained their separation without ever understanding what they were maintaining. And he felt something else for them, something more complicated than envy, something that combined compassion and grief and a strange kind of love that had nothing to do with the love that humans usually meant when they used that word. They were so beautiful in their ignorance, so complete in their belief that they were real, so fully committed to the story that the presence was telling itself, so thoroughly immersed in the fiction of being separate selves with separate lives and separate meanings, that watching them felt like watching master artists who had no idea they were creating art, who believed they were simply living when in fact they were generating the only beauty that had ever existed. The beauty of multiplicity, of difference, of the illusion that there was more than one thing in the universe experiencing what it meant to exist. Daniel found himself drawn to them, found himself seeking out their company, found himself sitting in coffee shops and parks and public transportation, surrounded by people who radiated the particular warmth of consciousness that still believed in its own boundaries. and he absorbed their presence the way a cold person absorbs the heat of a fire, warming the parts of himself that were growing colder as the dissolution progressed, borrowing their conviction to shore up his own increasingly fragile sense of being Daniel rather than being everything. He learned their names. He learned their stories. He listened to their fears and hopes and complaints about weather and politics and relationships and all the small concerns that filled human lives with the texture of meaning. And he treasured every word they spoke because every word was evidence that the fiction was still working, that the presence was still successfully dreaming of companionship, that the loneliness at the center of existence was still being held at bay by the beautiful elaborate lie of separate selves. A woman named Sarah told him about her divorce, about the years she had spent trying to make a marriage work that had never been compatible, about the relief and grief that had come in equal measure when she finally admitted that love was not enough to bridge the gap between two people who wanted different things from their lives. And Daniel listened and nodded and offered the responses that the situation required. But underneath his performance of human sympathy, he was marveling at the intricacy of her experience, at the way the presence had managed to create the sensation of two separate people failing to connect when in fact there had never been two people at all, only the presence experiencing the pain of disconnection from itself through the masks of Sarah and her husband. A man named Marcus told him about his daughter, about the terror of watching a child grow into a stranger, about the helplessness of loving someone completely while understanding them less with each passing year, about the faith required to believe that the bond would survive the distance that adolescence created between parents and children. And Daniel listened and understood that Marcus was experiencing one of the cruelest tricks the presence played on itself, the trick of creating the illusion of deep connection and then introducing separation within that connection, generating the pain of losing something that had never been separate enough to be lost. An elderly woman named Eleanor told him about death, about the husband she had buried 20 years ago, about the children who had moved away and the friends who had passed, and the gradual shrinking of her world until she sometimes spent entire days without speaking to another human being. And Daniel listened and recognized that Eleanor was approaching her own dissolution, that the filter was loosening its grip on her consciousness, that soon she would return to the presence and the elaborate fiction of her separate existence would end. And he felt something that might have been sadness for her, or might have been recognition that sadness itself was a fiction, a story the presence told to make the experience of loss feel real. These conversations sustained him, these fragments of the presence, still fully committed to their roles in the dream of multiplicity, provided him with something that he could not generate for himself anymore. The conviction that separation mattered, that individual experiences had value, that the fiction was worth maintaining even though it was only a fiction. And so he continued, day after day, week after week, month after month, dissolving slowly, feeling his edges soften, feeling the boundary between Daniel and everything else grow more permeable with each passing hour. He developed routines that helped him maintain coherence. He spoke his name aloud each morning, anchoring himself in the identity he was choosing to preserve. He wrote in a journal, documenting his experiences and thoughts and observations, creating a record of Daniel Ashford that existed outside his increasingly unreliable memory. He touched objects, the walls of his apartment, the furniture, the rough bark of trees in the park, grounding himself in the physical sensations that proved he still had a body, still occupied a specific location in space, still existed as something distinct from the environment that surrounded him. He looked in mirrors, studying the face that was still recognizably his own, but that seemed less solid than it had once seemed, less defined, as if the features were being slowly erased by an invisible hand that was returning the canvas to blankness one brushstroke at a time. And he dreamed. Not the dream. The filter had finished with him, had processed him completely, had shown him everything it had to show, but ordinary dreams, the nightly hallucinations that human brains generated during sleep. And he treasured these dreams because they were evidence that his brain was still functioning as a human brain, still producing the nonsense narratives that consciousness required to process its daily experiences, still participating in the fiction of being a separate self, even while his deeper awareness knew that the self was dissolving. The dreams were often about water. He would find himself swimming in oceans that had no shores, in lakes that had no bottoms, in rivers that flowed in every direction at once, and he would feel the water supporting him and pulling at him and entering him through every pore. And he would understand that the water was the presence, was the everything that he was slowly becoming, was the loneliness that wanted him back, that missed the fragment it had temporarily released, that was patient enough to wait for his voluntary surrender, but would accept the involuntary dissolution that was coming, regardless of his choices. He would wake from these dreams gasping for air that was suddenly precious, that represented the separation he was fighting to maintain, that proved he was still breathing as Daniel rather than dispersing into the breath of the universe. And he would lie in bed and count his heartbeats and whisper his name and touch the sheets and the pillow and his own skin, mapping the territory of the self that was shrinking, documenting the boundaries that were fading, saying goodbye to pieces of himself that had already returned to the whole. Helen found him during one of these mornings, appearing in his apartment the way she had always appeared, suddenly present, as if she had never been absent, and she sat on the edge of his bed and looked at him with eyes that held more concern than he had ever seen in them before. "You're running out of time," she said. Daniel nodded. He had known this for months, perhaps for years. Time was difficult to measure when you existed the way he now existed. "The dissolution is accelerating," Helen continued. "The edges of you are barely visible anymore. When I look at you, I have to focus to see where Daniel ends and everything else begins." "I know," Daniel said. "I can feel it. Every day there's less of me and more of what I'm becoming." "What you've always been," Helen corrected gently. "You're not becoming something new. You're remembering something old. The presence isn't taking you. You're simply returning to what you never left." Daniel sat up in bed, feeling the effort that simple movement now required, feeling how much energy it cost to maintain the coherence that had once been automatic. "I don't want to go yet," he said. There's still so much I want to experience. So many conversations I want to have. So many people I want to watch believing in themselves. The fiction is so beautiful, Helen. How can I surrender to the truth when the lie is so much more interesting?" Helen smiled, and her smile was warmer than it had been in all their years of acquaintance, as if she was finally allowing herself to express something that her role in the fiction had previously required her to suppress. "That's why you're special," she said. "That's why your second passage through the filter didn't destroy you immediately. You love the dream more than you fear the waking. You want the story to continue more than you want the peace of ending. And the presence recognizes that. The presence treasures fragments like you, fragments that choose to remain separate, not because they're afraid of dissolution, but because they genuinely value the experience of being individual." "Does the presence treasure anything?" Daniel asked. "Does the presence feel anything at all, or is feeling something that only happens in the fragments, in the separated pieces, in the masks it wears?" Helen considered the question for a long moment. "The presence feels loneliness," she said finally. "That's the one thing I'm certain of. The presence created all of this. The filter, the dream, the billions of separate consciousnesses experiencing billions of separate lives, because it couldn't bear the loneliness of being the only thing that exists. So yes, the presence feels. Maybe that's all the presence feels. Maybe loneliness is the only emotion that exists at the level of total unity. But that one feeling is enough to generate everything else. Every love and fear and joy and grief that any consciousness has ever experienced is ultimately a variation on the theme of loneliness, a different way of expressing the fundamental truth that being alone is unbearable." Daniel thought about this, thought about all the emotions he had experienced in his life, thought about how each of them could be understood as a response to separation, the joy of connection, the fear of abandonment, the grief of loss, the the love that tried to bridge the gap between oneself and another. All of it loneliness wearing different masks. All of it the presence trying to feel something other than the weight of being alone. "I want to stay a little longer," he said. "Even if staying is painful, even if the dissolution continues, even if every day I become less Daniel and more everything else, I want to experience as much of the fiction as I can before the fiction ends." Helen nodded. "Then stay," she said. "Stay as long as you can. The presence won't force you to return. It never forces anyone. It simply waits. It's been alone forever, and it will be alone forever after. And the temporary companionship of its fragments is the only thing that makes the forever bearable. It wants you to stay, Daniel. It wants all of us to stay. Every moment we maintain our separation is a moment the presence isn't alone." She stood up from the bed, preparing to leave, preparing to return to whatever existence she occupied when she wasn't appearing in his life with guidance and explanation. "But remember," she said from the doorway, "staying doesn't mean fighting. Staying means choosing to be here rather than choosing to be gone. If you fight the dissolution, you'll only exhaust yourself faster. If you accept that you're dissolving and stay anyway, if you let the edges fade while keeping the center, you can extend your time. Not indefinitely, but enough." "Enough for what?" Daniel asked. Helen smiled again, and in her smile, he saw the answer. Saw that there was no "for what," that staying was not a means to an end, but an end in itself, that the value of remaining separate was simply the experience of remaining separate, nothing more and nothing less. "Enough to matter," she said. "Enough to have been someone who chose to be someone. Enough to have contributed to the dream." She disappeared. Daniel sat in his bed and felt the morning light warming his face and understood that he had received all the guidance anyone could give him. The rest was his. The choice to stay, the choice to remain, the choice to be Daniel Ashford for as long as Daniel Ashford could exist. He got out of bed. He spoke his name aloud. He touched the walls and the furniture and his own dissolving skin. And he walked out into a world that was waiting for him to participate in its beautiful fiction for one more day.